questions, thank you for sending them in, about the end of furlough and the new job support scheme. Claire, thanks so much for joining us this evening. This is a really confusing time for people, isn't it? And we've got lots to get through. But first, could you just briefly explain kind of how the scheme works?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So the main JSS scheme is available if the employee can work at least 20% of their normal hours for their employer. Those normal hours worked are paid at their contractual rate through PAYE. But for the non-worked hours, and it gets a bit complicated with the maths, they get paid 2/3 of their salary. 5% of that is paid by the employer, and the rest is made up by a cash grant from the government a month later. In order to use the job support scheme for an employee, the employee has to have been paid by that employer before the 23rd of September, and also the employee has to have been a current employee working for that business on the 23rd of September. There is actually a separate scheme for businesses that are closed under national or local restrictions called JSS Closed. And under that closed scheme, the employee gets 2/3 of their salary and the employer doesn't have to make any contributions at all.
OK. That's interesting, actually, and our first question picks up on that a little bit. By the way, if you found that a lot to take in, rewind it and watch it back at your own pace. I think it's probably a good idea. So, Claire, first question is from Brenda in the Forest of Dean. She says, while businesses in Tier 2 who don't have to close get financial help, as you just mentioned, those in Tier 1 don't receive a thing. Brenda says hotels and bed and breakfasts are struggling as they don't have many guests due to travel restrictions, and she thinks the lack of help is unfair.
So Brenda's right. So there are cash grants available for businesses who are restricted in opening or are actually closed under mandatory rules, where they're in Tier 2 or Tier 3 areas, which isn't the case currently in the Southwest. For those businesses such as hotels, those cash grants aren't available, and also they aren't able to access the job support scheme closed. So they are required to give their staff 20% of their earnings, 20% of their work for 20% of their earnings, and make the 5% contribution on non-working hours as well. So there is a deficit in support for businesses such as Brenda's in Tier 1 areas.
OK. Next question is from Penny in Bristol. Penny's situation is her business cannot reopen. It designs and builds exhibition stands. So she's asking what category of the job support scheme, as it's set up at the moment, would she fall under?
So she'd be under JSS Open because she hasn't been required to close, even though she doesn't have any current trade. So that's one of the problems with the JSS scheme, because that there are actually two schemes within under one umbrella. And there is a gap between the two. So you might want to be under JSS Closed, but you're eligible to
but you have to be in a different tier. OK. David asks us a couple of things. First, would he get a new contract of employment under the JSS scheme? And if he's made redundant, what will his payment be based on?
So I wouldn't expect him to get a new employment contract. What the employer has to do is issue a written temporary working agreement for a minimum of 7 days under the JSS scheme. That's normally an appendix to the standard employment contract rather than requiring a new employment contract. On the redundancy pay, so to the extent that he's entitled to a payment if he is made redundant having been furloughed and JSS been used for his salary from Sunday, that payment will be made on his contractual earnings rather than his take-home salary under the job retention scheme or JSS.
Right. Wow. Claire, thank you so much for explaining it. It is a lot to take in, but we really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
That is a lot, isn't it? Now, don't forget,